Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm a Boeing 737 pilot, and in this video I'll show you how to handle wind gusts on the final approach and land the airplane in maximum crosswind conditions associated with the gusts. So you can see the present weather on the screen over there. We are approaching a runway 29 and the wind is 240 at 34, gust 44. Now let's have a quick look into the performance tool to see how that translates into a crosswind and a headwind condition. So this is our performance tool, currently fed with the steady wind component of 34 knots. This is a 22 knot headwind and a 26 knot crosswind. Now in order to calculate our crosswind component, we need to quickly type in the maximum wind component here, which includes the 44 knots of crosswind. So this is what we get. This is a crosswind component of 33 knots right now. And 33 knots actually is the crosswind limit for the Boeing 737 as well. So we are basically at the maximum crosswind component for the landing. To give you some quick reference, with the runway being dry and wet, and with a braking action of good to medium, your crosswind limit is 33 knots. Braking action medium, crosswind limit is 25, braking action medium to poor, it's 17, and with braking action poor or less than poor, the landing is prohibited. So that's the performance that we need to take. And keep in mind over here as well, the headwind component is now 29 knots, if we take the full gust into account, with a maximum crosswind component over there. So let's now go back to the landing performance with the standard steady wind component, 22 knots of headwind and 26 knots of crosswind. Now first of all we need to calculate the wind additive that we need on the approach. Keep in mind we are going to use half the steady headwind component and the full gust. So we have a steady headwind component here of 22 knots. Half of that is 11 knots, so we need to add 11 knots to our VREF. And then the full gust, in our case that is 10 knots, from 34 knots to 44 knots. So we would need an additive of more than 15 knots. And at this point we need to remember the flight crew training manual and the Boeing FCOM limit us to a maximum of VREF plus 15. Okay, so that's our wind additive for the approach. Now here's the next thing for us to take into account. When we look at the airplane in the simulator, let's understand the markings we have on the speed indicator. We are currently in a flap 5 configuration on our glide slope, and we will soon extend the landing flaps and the landing gear. So let's understand what those markings here mean. We have the VREF marking, which is exactly the VREF as entered in the FMC. So that is what we have over here, flaps 30, VREF 143. Now, on top of that, we have that white buck. That is VREF plus 20. This is the speed which should not be exceeded on the approach. Now, you can already think that if we are approaching at VREF plus 15, and we have a gust of 10 knots, our speed may go over the VREF plus 20 buck over here. And if that happens, we need to have the speed immediately return below the plus 20 buck. If it stays above VREF plus 20 for a sustained period of time, a go around is mandatory, as the approach will count as no longer stabilized. Another thing we need to understand is the logic of the auto throttle. So if you were to fly this approach with the auto throttle engaged, you need to be aware how the auto throttle works. And the auto throttle on approach basically is going to increase thrust quicker than it decreases the thrust. This is a safety measure built in by Boeing to avoid the speed falling under the target speed on the approach. And the 737 does quite a good job at avoiding the speed falling under the target. However, that comes at the cost of the speed basically constantly being above the target in gusty conditions. So here's what we're going to do. The auto throttle is not that reliable on an approach with gusty conditions. So we will probably have to use manual thrust here. And using manual thrust, we will have the speed buck at 5 knots below the VREF plus 20 buck as we've calculated earlier on. However, we are going to keep the speed between the magenta VREF plus 15 buck and the VREF indication. We are not going to aim to fly precisely the VREF plus 15 speed. Instead, this is a target speed, and going between the plus 15 buck and the VREF indication is what we aim for on this approach. Apart from that, we quickly have to talk about the usage of the autopilot. Usage of the autopilot in conditions like this is recommended as it significantly reduces your workload as the pilot flying. However, you have to be aware and you have to expect the autopilot to disconnect by itself when it senses that the weather conditions exceed the performance capability of the autopilot. And that can very well happen. I've seen it a couple times on the line already. So that is the theory of what we have to think about. Let's go ahead and fly the approach now and see what an approach like this actually looks like. I'm going to take the simulator out of active pause right now, and with that we are going to continue the arrival. A couple rain showers over here. We can see how we've already picked up a little bit of ice on the wiper here, so let's go ahead and make sure our anti-ice is on. Now there is one more thing that I want you to be aware of when flying an approach like this. That is the question when to disconnect the autopilot and the question when to configure the airplane for landing. Well, let's talk about configuring for landing first. As long as you are in VMC condition, it is permissible to fly a low drag approach in conditions like these, so you might extend the landing gear at 4 miles only. However, depending on the actual conditions that you're going through and depending on how strong the gusts actually are, it might be advisable to configure the airplane a little bit earlier, let's say for example at 5 miles, so that you have sufficient time on the final approach to stabilize the airplane, get the feeling of how the plane flies, and get to manually fly that plane. So, for our approach, I'm going to start configuring the airplane for landing at 5 miles. I am going to keep the autopilot engaged so that the autopilot can reduce my workload, basically until the point where I either see the autopilot acting up, or until a point where we are stabilized on final and the the landing checks are complete. So we're passing 5 miles, gear down, flap 15. Landing checklist, start switch is continuous, recall, checked, speed brake arm green light, landing gear down 3 green, auto brake 3 set, holding at flaps. Okay, flaps 30, set VREF plus 15, so that 143 plus 15 is 158 knots, and we've basically got that set already. So you can see how the autopilot struggles already to maintain that glide slope up here. And you can see how the thing is going up and down, so that is our first indications that the autopilot is slowly reaching its performance capability limits. The speed, as you see, is between the VREF plus 15 buck and VREF, and we'll aim to keep it over there. For now, the auto throttle is performing well, so we'll keep it engaged for now, but we are prepared to disengage it should the speed go above the VREF plus 15 buck, which, as we can see, it is slowly going now. Okay, so auto throttle off, manual thrust, and in gusty conditions, especially when the speed is varying by some plus minus 10 knots or so, it is always a good idea to basically just set the pitch and power values and only change your thrust setting momentarily. We're at a 60 tons landing weight right now, so we're looking at something around 57% N1 in order to keep our speed steady. So we're passing the landing gate. From now on, if the speed goes above the white buck, we need to correct for it immediately or a go around becomes mandatory. And let's disconnect the autopilot here. And you can see how I'm allowing the speed to vary, and I basically keep my thrust setting constant up here in order to achieve a stabilized approach. And keeping the thrust constant is something very important here. Do not chase the speed bug, instead only correct when you get big deviations like we do right now. Then add a couple percent, but not more than 10, And when your speed shows the correct trend, reduce thrust again to the previously established standard value. Don't flare for too long, just put it on the ground. And that's it. Welcome to Bornholm. Speed brake up, thrust goes normal. Note how I'm using aileron into the wind to keep the wings level at the moment. 100 knots. 80 knots. Manual brakes. And for the purpose of the video, I'm going to stop the airplane on the runway. So, thank you very much for watching. I hope that you have learned something today. And I'm looking forward to your comments on if you have known this already or if you learned something new. If you want to support the channel, you can do that through the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member, which is going to give you exclusive early access to new videos before they are released to the general public. Thank you very much for watching, and I'm looking forward to see you all again on the next one.